Okay, I think we can, nice, Julie. We can get started, let people trickle in as we do our kind of warm-ups and opening announcements. Welcome, everyone. My name is Terry Mumm. I'm the Digital Navigation Program Manager for Marylanders Online. We are part of the University of Maryland Extension Program, and we offer a statewide call center and skill development, training, tech support, all kinds of online resources. We'll share as much as we can today through this platform, but thanks for joining us. First of all, here at University of Maryland, all programs, activities, facilities are available to all without regard to race, color, sex, gender identity, expression, sexual orientation, marital status, age, national origin, political affiliation, physical or mental disability, religion, protected veteran status, genetic information, personal appearance, or any other legally protected class. We are here for everyone. So I'm going to get this session kicked off. We have a lot of information for you today with our guests. Today we'll provide some best practices and shared tools for evaluating digital inclusion efforts across Maryland and beyond. It will help programs prepare for reporting under state and federal grants by exploring realistic metrics and templates aligned with frameworks that work for Maryland. We start with a welcome and overview of why shared metrics are crucial. And then our guests, Sandy and Isaias, will present an outcome evaluation tools, lessons learned. Following the presentation, we will open the floor for group discussion to explore common barriers, celebrate successes, and foster collaboration in our evaluation efforts. And then we'll, at the very end, maybe talk about next steps and discuss some potential statewide partnerships for evaluation collaboration around digital inclusion programs. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers today. Up first is Sandy Saperstein. She's a senior evaluation consultant with Sharp Insight. Her evaluation work has focused on the nonprofit and public sectors and has included evaluation planning, literature reviews, qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis, data visualization, reporting, and capacity building. She currently supports the work of Marylanders Online. In addition to her work at Sharp Insights, Sandy is a lecturer in the UMD School of Public Health. Basically, she's a secret weapon to all of our success stories and probably the reason our data always looks so happy. So welcome, Sandy.
Yeah.
And after that, we'll listen to Isaias. Up next, we have Isaias. He's my esteemed boss and the man who proves that digital inclusion isn't just a buzzword, it's a way of life, especially when it comes to finding the best Wi-Fi signal in any space. Isaias is known for his uncanny ability to foresee evaluation challenges before they even appear on the Gantt charts. His passion for metrics is so strong, we suspect his morning coffee is brewed with data points. With over 17 years of experience spanning international development, IT, and law, including cutting-edge work in cryptography for global companies, he brings truly impressive breadth of knowledge. When he's not busy making sense of the numbers, you might find him passionately dissecting law reviews with his very precocious son. Please give a warm welcome to Sandy and Isaias.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Glad to be here today. I'm going to have to work on my intro paragraph to make it as fun as Isaias's, but that's a new task for me. So after our session today, we hope you leave here being able to describe some of the best practices for digital inclusion evaluation, that you'll be able to identify some simple strategies for measuring impact when you have limited staff and data systems. And then you'll also leave here with an understanding of how to start moving towards shared measurement. So we're going to start with best practices for digital inclusion program evaluation. And I really feel like this boils down to one thing. We have to reframe evaluation for a lot of people. I work with a lot of clients, and their experience with evaluation is that it's about judgment, and creates a lot of feelings of anxiety and overwhelmed. And I'm pleased to see that not everybody in our comments in the chat feel that way, but a lot of us do. And we want to reframe it so that people can see the benefit of evaluation. So how do we do that? We have to get everybody on the same page. We got to start with some evaluation basics. We've got to highlight what the positive aspects of evaluation are. And we need to make sure that everybody has a real consistent understanding of what our program is actually doing and what its effects are. So let's start with some basics. Here's CDC's definition of program evaluation. And you'll notice I've got some words highlighted to think about as I read this out loud. So program evaluation is the use of systematic data collection and analysis to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of one or more programs, policies, and organization. So systematic, we are doing this in a careful, organized, thoughtful way. We are using data to drive our findings. It's not just my gut feels this way, or I think this is how it works. We're using data to drive that. And we're looking at our programs in terms of, are they having an effect on our audience and how efficiently we're doing our work? So at its most basic, program evaluation answers 3 questions. What do we do? How well do we do it? And what difference do we make? And when we're first starting to get into thinking about evaluation, there's definitely some planning steps. So you want to think about, who are your key stakeholders? Who's got an interest in this evaluation and your findings? You know, is it your internal team? Is it the folks who are participating in your program? Is it your community partners or your funders or legislators? And then you want to really carefully think through the story you ultimately want to tell, and then match those evaluation activities so that you can tell your story. All right, the second way we get on the same page is we make sure that the folks we're working with on our team and our partners understand the way that evaluation can be of benefit. So first, it can help us support efficiencies. We can figure out what's working well, where are things not working well, and how can we improve those. We can use evaluation to test our assumptions. So I might have a program and I might say, I might assume that if people attend this program, then I'm going to have certain outcomes. And if I don't find that to be the case, then I can take those findings and use those to improve our programs. You know, maybe I thought that people were going to feel more confident at the end of our program. And if we find that's not the case, then maybe I've got to build in some activities to help them build their confidence. Program evaluation can also help you showcase your positive findings. A lot of you know the good work that you're doing out in the community, but you haven't had an organized way to tell your story. And when you use evaluation to help you tell your story, another benefit is that it can help you secure funding. All right, third, when we're getting people on the same page, you want to make sure that everyone on your team really understands your program. And I don't know if any of you know that folk tale about 4 blind guys in a room with an elephant, and they have their hands on different parts of the elephant, and they describe the elephant completely different. And I find that when I work with organizations, a lot of time it's that's just such a good analogy. People don't really understand the programs in the same way. So how do we get people on the same page? Well, I want you all to learn to love a logic model. And I have had people tell me logic models have given them stomach aches, anxiety. Well, we want to demystify that process because it's a really good way of getting folks on the same page. A logic model is really just a graphic depiction that helps you make the connection between what it is you're doing and what difference you ultimately make. So it gives you and your team a common vocabulary around your program and what successes you expect. And it makes it easier for you to talk about your program to maybe your external funders. And a good logic model will provide the foundation for your evaluation activities. So I'm sure that many of you have seen logic models before, but typically we have these 6 building blocks. We have our, starting from the left, our resources and inputs, activities, outputs, and our outcomes that we break down into short, mid, and long-term outcomes. And really, at each of those blocks, they're going to help us answer some different questions. So in terms of our resources or inputs, it's really about what we need to do our programs. Our activities are what is it that we're doing? Our outputs are really the measure of our activities, specifically, what is it that we're delivering? And our outcomes, again, are about what difference do we make? And I think one area where people get a little stuck is mixing up things that you're doing and things that are going to have an effect on your audience. And so think about outcomes as the effect on your participants. Logic models should be logical, and they're really a series of if-then statements. And so if you can do this kind of if-then series, it'll make a little bit more sense to you. So if I want to run my programs, then I need certain resources. They could be human, they could be financial, they could be technological, it could be around space. If I have those resources, I can run my activities. If I run those activities, then I'll deliver the services that I've had planned. And if I deliver those services, then my clients or communities are going to have changed in certain ways. Now, one sticking point for logic models, I'm sure some of you have learned at some point that our short, mid, and long-term outcomes are tied to timeframes. In the evaluation world, yes, timeframes come into play, but we also think about this a little bit differently. So we think about short-term outcomes as the kind of changes that I like to think of it as that have to happen in an individual's head before they can make big changes in their life. So maybe they have to know something about the topic area. Maybe we've got to change their attitudes where they're going to go from somebody who doesn't think that they can use computers or the internet to somebody who has confidence and believes that they can do it. And they might need some basic skills. So again, this is like all the stuff that happens in their head in the short term. And if I can change knowledge, attitudes, and skills, that can ultimately lead to our midterm outcomes, which are changes in actions and behaviors. And maybe if we're working at an organizational level, could be changes in policies. And then ultimately, when we get people changing their actions and behaviors, that leads in the long term to changes in status. And when I talk about changes in status, I'm talking about really big picture things. Like, for example, when we are thinking about health, maybe I have reduced disease incidence in my community, or I have better quality of life because people are able to self-manage their chronic disease. It could be changes in status around employment, around being able to engage in civic and social activities. Maybe I have I've entered into an educational program, or I've received a certification, or I'm now able, or my community is now able to access essential services. So here is a kind of a sample logic model for a digital skills training class. So starting on the left, here are some of the resources that we might need to do those classes. Our activities can be general, implement digital skills training classes, and it's our outputs where we get really specific. So maybe in my outputs, I'm going to capture the number of classes I implemented. By type, I mean, what are the content areas that we're covering in my digital skills classes? How many hours of programming did I have? How many participants came? Who were the participants who came? What are their backgrounds? And ideally, we want to make sure that we're reaching the people our programs are designed for. And then an important output is satisfaction. This is another area of confusion with logic models a lot of times. People will put satisfaction in outcomes, but really satisfaction is really a measure of your program, right? If somebody liked your program, if they liked the instructor, that increases the odds they're going to show up and engage in the activities, but it's not really an outcome for them. So our outcomes for digital skills class participants might be that they learn something new about the digital class content, and they have more confidence and skills to engage in those activities. And if they have more knowledge, confidence, and skills, then they are going to be using those digital skills to perform their everyday tasks. Again, this depends on what your content is, but maybe it's now they are able to use email for those social connection pieces, or they have adopted internet safety practices, or depending on your class, they might be using those digital skills to obtain or advance education and employment. And again, our long-term outcomes really relate to those changes in status. So that was a lot, but if we engage in those three practices, helping people understand what evaluation is, the benefits of evaluation, and then really doing a deep dive into what our programs are about, that gets folks kind of on the same page and ready to think about evaluation. Which brings us to, what are some tips for engaging in evaluation when we know we have limited staff or data systems? So my best practice here for you, be realistic, not idealistic. You've got to really carefully think about what it is that you want to measure and be really clear about what's realistic, given your staffing, given your resources, balanced with what are your funders asking you for. And at this point, I just want to put in a plug for thinking about the ethics around data collection. You want to keep in mind that people participating in evaluation activities, that participation should be voluntary. You want to protect their privacy, so don't collect identifying information like their name or their email if you don't need that for anything. And be mindful of participant burden. Keep these data collection efforts as short as you possibly can. Focus on the need to know. What do I absolutely need to know at the end of the day, and not the nice to know. You want to let your logic model drive your data collection. So if I start over here in outputs and I'm looking at those, how many classes am I delivering and how many participants? I can set up a simple tracking sheet and really have an organized way to capture that stuff. If I want to know who's attending my programs, then I want to maybe make sure that my survey tool captures some demographic information. And when I think about my outcomes, I want to make sure I have some items that relate to those outcomes. So the logic model can really drive what it is that you want to collect. I mentioned a tracking spreadsheet for your outputs. If you're new in this world, another thing that is really nice to use a tracking spreadsheet for is to log any follow-ups you have with participants. I know in our evaluation work for Marylanders Online, a lot of the organizations that we talked to said, yeah, well, people come back and they tell me, I got this job, or thank you so much, I now am in this new bachelor's degree program. So log that in a systematic way so that, maybe at your year end, you'll have a lot of compelling data without a whole lot of effort. I want you to think about the research design for your outcomes. And if you've ever taken a research methods class, you've learned that the gold standard is that we want an experimental design and we need to have a control group. Or maybe if we're just one group, we're going to collect data before and after. And that would be really amazing. But in our experience, that is not always realistic. A lot of times what is realistic, at least at the start, is doing some kind of post-only survey or maybe some follow-up interviews, given our time and resource constraints. And if I'm doing some kind of post-only thing, I just want to make sure my items really tie back to the class, right? After attending this class, I know more about, or I am more confident about. That gives you a little bit more kind of cause and effect. Ideally, we could do some sort of longer term follow-up and get to those big changes in status that we talked about. And ultimately, I'll just plant a seed here. This is beyond the scope of our day today. But ideally, you'd want to show return on investment, right? We give these classes, and what are the impacts at the end of the day? So, all right, you have some ideas for what you want to measure. You have to think about what measurement tool, what survey tool or interview guide am I going to use? It's always helpful to see if anything already exists, so you can, search the published literature, or talk to your friends who are doing similar work at another organization, and maybe folks will share tools. I'll foreshadow that a little bit for our shared measurement conversation. You want to think about collecting both quantitative numerical data as well as qualitative, the kind of words and stories data, because both can really help tell your story in a powerful way. The numbers are nice, and a lot of our funders want that numerical data, but it's those words and stories that really get that emotional impact of the changes that you make. You do need to know your audience. And so this is a little bit of a downside of using existing tools. You have to understand what are the reading abilities of your audience, and you want to make sure your survey questions are in plain language. So sometimes tools that you might find in the published literature might not be appropriate for your audience. So you have to think about that a little bit. You want to think about the format you're providing those tools in. So if I'm doing a survey, an online survey has a lot of advantages, but for folks in digital skills classes, and I have been humbled in this project, that is not always the best way to get data from people. So we might need paper formats. We might need to be thinking about alternate formats for people with disabilities, right? Like we might need our surveys in large print or in Braille, or in the primary language that your audience speaks. There are low or no cost tools that don't have to be like that. The tools themselves don't have to be the burden to entry. So Google Forms are great, they're free, but the downside is your clients, your participants have to be able to use technology, and that can be a little bit of a stumbling block. If you're using paper surveys, the downside is on the other end, you've got to enter that data so that you can analyze it. And then sometimes, like if you're really new to this, we sometimes use on-the-wall surveys. We take flip chart paper, we put a couple of big outcome questions, and we can make these quantitative, and we can make them open-ended. So, and I'm sorry, this is a little bit blurry. I took it from a photo from a workshop we did, but this was asking people to rate their confidence in using evaluation. So there's a scale from not at all confident to extremely confident. And people can just walk around and answer the questions by putting sticky dots or check marks. You can have open-ended. How are you going to use what you learned in class today? And so sometimes that can be really helpful. All right, last point is that you really need to provide orientation and training for your staff as you engage in this. So you got to start with the why you're evaluating the program. Got to start with those evaluation basics and benefits. You've got to explain how and when these evaluation activities are going to be conducted and what their responsibilities are. Sometimes we actually provide a script, and we need to make sure that we build in time for that post-survey to be administered before the class ends. You want to make sure your staff has what they need to use those tools. So whether it's a link or a QR code to an online survey, or enough printed copies, pens, and a manila envelope so that people can privately put their surveys in, or sticky dots and markers and flip chart paper. So you need to have those, the whats. And then you want to follow up after the data collection to make sure that people are actually collecting the data and to identify and troubleshoot any issues. So that was a brief overview of some tips and tricks for getting started in the world of evaluation. I am going to turn it over to Isaias to talk about shared measurement.
Thank you, Sandy. That was really insightful. Do I need to share my screen, or I can work from yours? Okay, I'll share my screen. Yep, I'll start from where you left off. Can you all see my screen? All right, so I'll focus on objective 3. How do we move towards shared measurement? So when Terry was making the introduction, I asked ChatGPT to give me a sarcastic lawyer's take on evaluation. So there is a tension between compliance on the one hand, right? And then there is the other side is making meaningful impact. So when you're evaluating your programs, your work, you're trying to show the impact the programs make. At the same time, you need to do compliance work. So that's the tension between funder requirements and then the work you're excited to do. So sometimes it would be trying to prove the worth of your program, but just in time when the funds are running out, right? So that's the real life circumstances that affect evaluation. But for our purposes, if we need to move to shared measurement, now I'm thinking about there is an ecosystem or community of practice working on digital inclusion activities. So we may have several organizations working across Maryland providing digital skills training, digital navigator training, or access to devices, supporting individuals, access reliable, high-speed, affordable internet at home. So how do you make sure that what one organization is doing supports the other? Or how do you avoid working in silos so you have shared impact? So trying to move towards shared measurement, ideally you would establish a collaborative framework that would allow different groups to systematically collect and report data using standardized as in shared metrics and methods. So there are challenges in this. So organizations may be required either by law or by funders not to share data with each other, or they may have, even if they are operating within the same funding instrument, they may have certain specific requirements to them. So that may, but to the extent possible, developing collaborative framework is really crucial. So what are the steps you can take? Establish an advisory group. For example, the Maryland Digital Equity Coalition or regional coalitions like Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition or Montgomery or Carroll County that are in existence in Maryland. So they may be the starting point for these. And ideally, you'll have people with real life experience in the work. So instead of starting with a template, as Sandy was mentioning, you would start from the material reality that you can measure. And then determine the current state of measurement for your area. So ask questions like, what's already being collected, right? Let's not burden the people we're asking to respond to our surveys with information that someone else is already collecting, if that's possible. What instruments are being used? How is the data collected? How is it stored? What's working and what's challenging? After that, you do asset mapping or wider scan. You may look for out of state, nationally or internationally, that may be useful best practices. And then you can develop guidelines, framework, a logic model, definitions, or theory of change that are shareable. And then actually create the measures based on the steps. So what are the measurements that matter? And then get feedback on what's feasible and what's relevant. To the extent possible, standardize with clear definitions for the key terms. And then develop supporting resources. So I will not go into detail. I'll give people opportunity to ask questions so we can be more responsive and interactive. But I want to highlight for the state of Maryland, right? We have the statewide digital equity plan. So if we take that as a unifying instrument for ensuring digital equity inclusion in Maryland, it outlines as a vision 5 essential elements. So access to affordable, reliable internet connectivity at home is one. Access to computing devices and the opportunity to maintain it. And then based on feedback that was received during the consultation phase, accessible devices for those that need them. This would be assistive or adaptive technology. And then an opportunity to learn digital skills, tools and information to be safe online with the rapidly changing technology landscape, avoiding scams, avoiding phishing, avoiding malware, and then online state resources that are accessible and usable. So for these essential elements, the document also outlines the core principles. So inclusivity and accessibility, equitable access, community engagement and collaboration. So this takes us to the development of shared measurement. Sustainability. I mentioned earlier, evaluation is done sometimes in a rush, or once evaluation is done, you don't have the opportunity to implement the lessons learned in the future. This is the case with the Digital Equity Act. This is the case with the capacity grants, given the current climate in the nation. And then making data-driven decisions. Similarly, the Digital Equity Plan identifies priority populations. So the language here may be suspect given the recent changes, but we rely on the document as it currently stands in effect. So while the document itself does not use the term shared measurements, it does highlight the need to coordinate in terms of a process of alignment and mutual support. In the next slide, I'll share one example. There are key outcomes that the document outlines. It's not just about providing access to people. That's important, that's foundational. But beyond that, what impact, what outcomes do we expect? Economic and workforce development, education, health, civic and social engagement, and delivery of essential services. So in the State Digital Equity Plan, it identifies who are the key stakeholders. How do you align digital equity with the agency, the other agency partner priorities? For example, for economic and workforce development, the Office of Statewide Broadband, the Maryland Department of Labor, and other partners are identified. What the document also does well is it identifies existing plans that are corresponding to that specific outcome. For example, for economic and workforce development, it identifies Capital Projects Fund and the Maryland Workforce Innovation Act State Plan 2020-2024. So under the digital equity alignment, it articulates, okay, working with these partners, what do we try to achieve? We're trying to achieve enhancing employability, closing skill gaps, inclusive participation, preparing for future jobs. So these are all articulated in the document. So there are other similar outcomes, educational outcomes. It's corresponding with the Maryland Blueprint and State Plan for Higher Education. If it's health education, there is Maryland Healthcare Commission metrics. So it does a really good job of matching the digital equity outcomes with corresponding cross-sector outcomes. In concluding this portion of the presentation, I think we can use the document as a starting point, but it requires strengthening collaboration. And one platform would be MDEC or the regional coalitions I mentioned. So I'll stop here and then open for questions.
Questions, comments? Let's jump back into it. Somebody has to have a question.
Maybe we can ask questions from the audience and
Mm-hmm.
say, if you're so if you're interested in this topic, presumably you're working in digital inclusion activities. So what do you find useful? What do you find challenging? So some of the challenge would be the funding runs out. You don't have meaningful amount of time to do the evaluation and implement the lessons learned. But what challenge do you face when you attempt to create shared measures or a collaborative framework?
I have a question. How do we best define the success for each type of intervention, right? Like, as we look through the long-term outcomes, like how do we make those, like how do we define positive outcomes in civic and social engagement, for example? Maybe Sandy, that's something you have an idea about.
Yeah, well, I have, oh, sorry.
Well, I was just thinking, is that where we have the sort of participatory design with our stakeholders?
Yeah, and I think some of it, we might have to dig a little bit about what is it that our participants are actually wanting to do and what are they doing? One of the folks who I interviewed during our last end of year evaluation talked about being able to email his doctor and his daughter. And so like really breaking down what could those outcomes be for different people, I think is really an important starting place. And I think that's like where you put all your heads together, especially the folks who are out doing programs, might have really a better participating today if anybody wants to jump in there and share things. But it's usually, unfortunately, we don't always have a lot of time or budget for those follow-up pieces. But I think those are really important to getting at what do those outcomes really look like for different people. And it might be different, if you're working with older adults versus, younger adults who are disconnected. I'm sorry, I'm laughing at Maria. That was Mike. Who
What's
wanted
happening?
just laughing at a comment about who was this interviewee. But I mean, it was really life-changing for a lot of people. And unfortunately, some folks don't even have the words because this is just a new world for them. I think that's the piece that I have over the course of this project have more appreciation to of, there are people who have just been on the outside and they feel themselves getting left behind, but like they're a little defensive about it. And then when those walls come down, how grateful they feel, to know how to use a QR code. So I think it's really having a deep understanding of your participants and where they're going and where your programs are going to get them. And I saw, and I lost, I think there was a comment from Julie about collecting demographics. Yeah, I share that concern too. And again, it's the collect what you absolutely have to, not just the things that might be interesting if the world was a little bit different. And then you could collect, I know the extension programs collect demographics separately from the survey tools themselves. So you might know we collect the demographics as part of the registration process. So we'll have an overall understanding of who signed up for the class, but we're not tying that to their survey information. So that could be a good way to protect things.
If I can add a few sentences about collecting data that may put people in harm's way. Generally, even in normal circumstances, you would train your team members on ethical conduct of evaluation in terms of data collection, processing, and reporting. So for example, certain programs require you to have a data privacy and security protocols in place. If it's electronic data, you will be asked about what's your retention policy, how do you store it, when do you dispose of the data. And if you have more than one person handling the data or more than one entity, so there's the data controller, and then you have the data processor. So those are really important considerations that are from both a compliance perspective, at the same time from ensuring the safety and security of the program participants. This will be required training for anyone that participates in program evaluation.
I think a strong example that I've experienced around this issue is with after-school programs and Department of Education funding for the state. And so each site that was funded, and it was hundreds of sites across the state, had that shared tool. But we had to work very closely with the Department of Ed and the local districts and execute data sharing agreements that all had those things very spelled out. And in some cases where there was maybe some outcome data, like testing outcome data for students, we would get everything, the report basically ready to go to that point, and then we would hand it over to the district, and they would anonymize the data and then import it into the report. And I mean, that's years and years of building this shared program, but what it provided people were measurements to seek funding and to really see how impactful their programs were and also where the need was. So I'm hoping we can get to something like that, but it will, I think what you mentioned, Isaias, is important. Will take a lot of effort around, building those relationships and executing those MOUs and data sharing agreements and things of that nature, but it can be done. Let's see, we have a question from Abdulaziz in the chat. What strategies can we implement to improve patient participation in data gathering, particularly among individuals who may be hesitant due to immigration-related concerns or cultural biases? How can we build trust and ensure that our approach is sensitive, inclusive, and respectful of their backgrounds and experiences? It's a great question.
That's a really great question. I love that question. I think some of the things have start when you're developing your tools. And in an ideal world, if you're working with a particular community, you're having somebody from that community review your tool to make sure you're asking questions in a way your audience understands it. I have an example that popped into my head that doesn't relate to this project, but I was working with a doctoral student who was collecting data on the use of apps for mental health in Bangladesh. And one of the questions on a survey that she found, it was a depression scale, and it asked, how often are you feeling blue? And when she did the survey review beforehand, that was not terminology that, here in the US, sure, we understand what feeling blue means, but that audience didn't understand it. So when you can have that review of your tool beforehand to make sure the questions are going to be understandable, that would be a great step one. A step two, again, is not collecting identifying information on the survey tool itself, if you can do that. If you're using electronic surveys, a lot of them will default and collect email, or they'll collect IP addresses. So you have to be a little savvy with your tool. I always shut those off unless there's some reason where we need to collect it. And when you're introducing the survey, and this is where I said, like, you want to train your staff or have a script and say, we're not collecting identifying information. We're going to pool all this data together. We're going to report out some participants said this, but we're not we're not going to identify you personally. So you can build that trust with your audience. And if you have an audience that is not going to put something on paper, maybe doing that kind of flip chart around the room survey may be a better way to collect data from your audience. I don't know, Isaias or Terry, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I can. It's along the lines of what you outlined. One is co-design or co-creation with the community members, the intended audience of the work you're doing. So involve the people you're trying to serve early on in the design of your evaluation tools. And then you will learn what's appropriate terminology. Another example is in one of the surveys, it's outside the US, but a location was described one way. But the political circumstances had changed in that country. So that name was not acceptable. So people who were conducting the survey were detained. So that kind of, it's not the same as here, but it also, shows the reality of the power dynamics when you're collecting data, the respondents, there is usually, so you have to acknowledge that power dynamic and training your staff and ensuring that the respondents understand this is entirely voluntary and they can stop at any time. And in a language that it can be translated in having a respected member of the community, trusted member, who has the integrity to make sure that what you're asking is acceptable and meets the standards of ethical evaluation. And like Sandy said, clarifying why it's being collected, for what purpose, how long you're going to retain it, and who has access to it. So you have to be as transparent as possible. I think those are the ways you can try, but sometimes even the most transparent outlining of how and why you're collecting data will not convince people to respond to your questionnaire, and you have to be okay with it. Sometimes the temptation or the pressure is, if you don't collect the data and you don't show the results, your funding will dry up. I think you have to be willing to say, let the funds dry. Will not engage in data collection if people feel unsafe.
You just made me think of something else, Isaias. I've seen people tell, when they're using electronic surveys, say, your participation is completely voluntary, and then they make all the questions required. That is not completely voluntary. People do need to be able to skip and not answer anything they don't want. So just tuck that in the back of your heads when you're developing surveys.
I think you touched on something really important too. First of all, like, we should always design our evaluation as we design our program, like at the beginning, not at the end, as Isaias mentioned. But second is, it's okay to say no. It's okay to say no to a funder. It's okay to determine that a project maybe isn't a good fit for your ethos and, and what you're trying to accomplish and what's most important for you. I've had that happen where and also sometimes it's okay to be like, we just can't run the program and collect this level of data that they're required. I mean, especially with some federal programs. I mean, I think it's really important to really outline that up front and like what that need is, and go at it from that perspective. Because I think I see it two ways. Like, sometimes people don't apply for big grants because they're worried about the evaluation component and whether they can do that. And that's a shame, because it is something that can be done and just takes time and effort and energy. Or they do the opposite, where they're like, yeah, we can do this, it's no big deal. And they don't design those tools. They don't think about the impacts or the data agreements or things that they may need to actually pull that off. So it takes a lot of upfront thinking and planning about what you want and what you're willing to do to get that money. What about questions? There's Vishnu, I see.
I had one comment to add. I'm loving this discussion here. And I feel that when we have money or when we are running a program, oftentimes we're so much, digged in the, nuts and bolts of that project, what you're trying to do. And I think evaluation kind of helps you in a way to look at it from a bigger picture that, okay, when I am creating this program, how much of that is also contributing towards long-term sustainability and not just your short-term goals and achievements. So, yeah, I think it would be very valuable to actually use that time when you do have the funds to engage in some of that long-term planning, and the evaluation can really, really help you maximize your effect. Yeah. So thank you so much for doing this presentation. I think it was wonderful.